When I was in high school, someone explained to me, a teacher, an old man with big ears and obnoxious ties, that if the nucleus of an electron was the size of a basketball, the electrons moving around the outside would be 2 kilometers away, something like that. He used an example in the city. It'd be as far away as this street. And it made sense to me. When I was in university, perhaps, maybe later, I did some study and found that there isn't something the size of say a dried pea rotating around something the size of a basketball. That the electron isn't a solid thing as far as most people can understand. It doesn't exist at all. It's a kind of undefined probability cloud completely around the nucleus in a given shell. Yeah? It's a potential. Where is it? It's everywhere in that space. And if you look at it closely, you can find it, very briefly, but only with limited success. And Heisenberg and uncertainty and all that. But what I want you to get out of this stuff that I'm sure whoever you are, you don't understand, is that rather than being a hard thing, it's a probability. It's a potentiality. It's sort of in this space. Yeah? And maybe there's this much percentage chance it'd be here, and this much percentage chance it'd be there, but it is only a potential, but it's a field of potential spread out all the way around the nucleus. So in effect, it's only in one spot, but it's in all those places with different probabilities. And I don't expect anybody to really get that. But what I want you to do is be able to make the simple step from this thing is definite, it's, and I quote, real, and it's right here and exactly like this, to it is a potentiality existing in a probability space. Do you follow any of that? Alright. Now I've drawn some diagrams for you in the past, like the pyramid, with the blue and the red, the black and the white and the gold, and said this is a probability space. That you as a human exist somewhere in there. Like the electron, you don't exist at a specific point that's real. You have a sort of probability space within that, and it can't go outside, because humans can only exist in that pyramid, in that horn. And this is very difficult, not so much to understand, but to accept. Because you reach out and touch what you're sitting on, you say it's real. Right? You try and walk through a wall and you bang your forehead and your increasingly large nose. And you say it's real. Right? Your boyfriend, girlfriend, favorite dog, whatever cheats on you. You say these feelings, they're real. But they're not. Not exactly. When you go to see a movie, the main character falling in love or risking their life or whatever, none of that's real. It's just light played out on a screen. And even that which it's an image of is made up. It's all fakery in Hollywood or Bollywood or wherever it's done. Yeah? But when you look at it, it seems real. And you fall in love with Han Solo or get fascinated by Luke Skywalker, or you're deeply offended when Darth Vader says, "I am your father," right? In that moment, when you're sitting in a theater, Darth Vader seems real. Yeah. And later that night, when you have a nightmare about Darth Vader, or a dream about flying a TIE fighter, that dream, that nightmare, they seem real. But they're not. Right? It was just patterns of light playing out on the screen, and your mind, because it's very simple, saying, that's real, that must be real, I saw it. And so you dream about it, you fantasize about it. But you have these ideas of real only because you have a very simple mind. Why do you have a very simple mind? Because if you had a complicated mind that could understand all these things, you wouldn't experience your life in the same way. Right? You come into this lifetime not to be an advanced, extended meta entity, because that's what you were before, right? Some people like camping. Imagine that you went camping and you took your whole house and your whole neighborhood, right? Then you'd go to sleep that night in your own bed and brush your teeth in your own bathroom and so on. And you'd say, this ain't camping. Instead, you sleep in an uncomfortable little sack on lumpy ground and droning insects all around, and eat nasty coffee or drink nasty coffee brewed over a log fire. Right? This is the point of camping. Or fishing. Sitting out someplace where you're being chewed on by the bugs and burned by the sun, and hoping that some slimy, disgusting tasting creature will bite your hook and you cook it over a campfire and say, it was good because I caught it. But fish aren't good. Fish are terrible. I mean, not personally. I've known some very nice fish. Some of my best friends are fish. No, they just taste awful. Right? If you went fishing or camping and you had the same experience you had in your living room, if you went to an amusement park and had the same experience you had in your front yard, you'd be disappointed. You, as a larger meta entity, a more aware being, intentionally limit yourself to a tiny brain and a tiny range of emotions, so that when you come to this life and rough it, like camping, like fishing, like going to an amusement park, right? When you go to an amusement park, you know that image you're seeing up there isn't real. You know it's not really a dragon that goes rawr when your roller coaster goes past it. It doesn't matter that you know it's fakery. You limit yourself. You limit your disbelief, and like a child you enjoy the amusement park, right? So quit thinking you're smart. You ain't. You ain't smart. Nobody. Nothing in a human body is smart, because you have a very limited set of sense perceptions. The majority of things you don't even notice. And those you do, you lock down into a tiny bubble and say, this is real. Yeah. But the truth is, it's far more beautiful and elegant and subtle. And the entirety of that experience of what it is to be human happens in this potential space, like the electron around the nucleus. An electron doesn't happen randomly around a nucleus. It shows up in the primary shell, at least until there are two, and the third shows up in the shows up in the next shell, the, I don't know, D shell or something, right? And they get 2 there, and you get 8 in the next shell, and so on, and it creates your periodic table. They can't just be anywhere. They've got to be in a defined probability space. And to be human, you have a defined probability space. If you get too far outside that, you cease to be human. You begin to perceive a lot less and become, I don't know, some kind of more limited animal. Or you perceive a lot more and you realize that this whole humanity thing is just camping in your backyard, and it loses all the excitement of, oh no, what's that noise? Is it a bear? You lose all that because I'm just in the backyard and that's just the dog. Right? You lose all the cool. The first time that you fell in love, if you have, most adults have, rocked your world. The first time you fell out of love with that person was immensely destructive and painful. For the fortunate ones, the second time you fell in love is the best experience in your life, because you realize that if you let yourself, you can fall in love again and again and again. The first time that you see, I don't know, your child born, you're first getting a new puppy or kitten, these are amazing experiences you can look back on and feel totally filled up with joy, beauty, and excitement. But only because you're very limited. If you were this larger you, these experiences wouldn't be huge, life-changing. They'd just be, oh, well, I've done that 100,000 times before. Yeah. So the experience of being human involves wearing a human body and walking in the human world and sitting on couches you think are real and banging your nose into walls you think are real. And none of those things are real. They're all just experiences across a potential range of experiences. And you can think of that potential range as, like a glowing line of light moving through the world around you. And you're like a little ant walking along that glowing line of light. Right? And around that line of light, there's a little bit of a probability space. Some people, those who've gone crazy, visionaries, and so on, they can get a little further from that line of light and move around it. Others, the stoics, the realists, they're bound to the very center and can't get outside that at all. Right? There's this probability space, potentiality space, around that line that is human. Yeah? So, imagine this glowing sort of lightsaber-sized beam of light running across the room, and the most boring, stoic, science says so, so it must be true, usually said by people who know almost nothing about science. Right? Marching right down the center of that tube, and the people way out at the fringe of the, if the tube is the size of a lightsaber, then the width of a lightsaber on each side, kind of around it, this sort of softly glowing, when you see a lightsaber and they turn it on, it's got this sort of diffuse aura around it. You've got that diffuse aura with a lot less people, way out to the very fringes, where the people are completely mad. They're so far from reality. Reality is in quotes always, right? They're so far from that core line, the center of the lightsaber where the boring ants are marching, right? That they're completely dysfunctional, right? And you get any further out than that, you simply can't exist. You get so dysfunctional you can't perceive a reality, you fade away. You go find a different experience and you're not human, or you just die. Right? So, down the center of this lightsaber is an incredibly dense beam of this glowing light that the vast majority of humans are marching like a line of ants through the jungle down the center here. And a smaller number sort of flying just above, and an even smaller number flying further away. So there's just a very tiny few, the greatest visionaries, the seers, the prophets, the creatives, the artists, the best of artists, are even further out. Right? Genius and madness are very close. This is why there's a distribution between stoicism and creativity. And the more creative you are, the better you are at art, but the worse you are at quote reality. The more stoic you are, the better you are at dealing with this quote reality, but you totally lack creativity. There's this distribution, and it's very dense at the center along this line, and there's fewer and fewer people outward around this line. Right? And for the sake of convenience, I'm going to call that line a timeline, that lightsaber. A timeline. It's not, but it's a word you understand. Right? And so the majority of people are real close to the center of the timeline. I know this is real. I remember this. I'm absolutely certain he said, no, I am your father. And those a little further away saying, no, I remember him saying, Luke, I'm your father, right? Because they're not as tied to the timeline. And those a little further out saying, I'm a butterfly, and being, locked up in a cell somewhere. Until you get too far out and the potentiality space just fades away and humans can't exist. That potentiality space can be represented by the horn. It's a potentiality space in which humans can exist. You get outside it, you're gone. It can be represented by the pyramid with the black, white, blue, red, gold points on it. You get outside that, you cease to exist. Humans have to exist within a potentiality space by definition. Right? You'd be like a goldfish getting outside the goldfish tank. You can be right in the center of that tank or way over towards the glass and be fine. But once you pass the glass and you're outside, you flop around for a bit and you die. You can only exist within the potentiality space that supports human. Yeah. So, we look at a silly but important movie like Back to the Future. Right? Little boy rides his skateboard up to Twin Pines Mall, goes back in time, runs over a tree. When he comes back, it's Lone Pine Mall. Because there was only ever one tree there, and everybody in the world knows, everybody in that town knows, it's always been Lone Pine Mall. But he remembers it was Twin Pines Mall. This is a timeline shift. What he's done is go back and change the timeline. Yeah? It isn't complicated. That sort of lightsaber track of glowing lights that you little people are marching down, it exists within a very large tube. Right? Like one of those drain pipes you see kids crawling into in movies. And it can exist anywhere within. Right? This timeline can exist anywhere within that larger probability space, but if the timeline went outside it, everybody would die. The timeline would die. It can only exist within. Just like a person can only exist within a timeline. Right? Or a fish in a tank. I've talked about this before, but I'm trying to weave it into something a little simpler, a little easier to envisage. Right? With ideas like a child sleeping in a tent in their backyard, pretending they're Conan the Barbarian or Lewis and Clark or Robin of the Hood or any other. Because while the mathematics behind this are immensely complex and take a mind far greater than a human mind to understand, you don't need the mathematics. If you've ever played Pac-Man on your computer, and that little yellow boy said waka 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 waka, right? Or you watched Guardians of the Galaxy where he makes a giant pig Pac-Man, Puck-Man. You don't have to understand the type of encoding that the video file goes through, or the medium on which it's stored, or the transmission of data across a bus, or the projection onto a screen. Right? You don't need to understand how Pac-Man is coded in decision trees and probabilities of this and that. You don't need to understand those things to play Pac-Man or to see Guardians of the Galaxy 2. Right? You don't need to understand the mathematics of the human experience to fall in love, to have a child, to climb a mountain or climb a tree. And so what I'm giving you are Pac-Man type examples. Simple things you can understand, which, while I'll talk about probability distributions and such, you don't need to understand the math. You can, if you like, see the center of that lightsaber, that sort of tube of glowing light that is a timeline. You can see that as the mean of the distribution, and the less and less people as you get further from it, as an abruptly truncated normalized distribution. Right? Meaning less and less people towards the outside, 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviation, so on. But once you get past a certain point, it just truncates. There's nobody exists too far away from that norm because they leave the probability space. And you can understand how, simplistically, how running over a tree could make Twin Pines Mall into Lone Pine Mall. Right? Or getting the sports almanac into the hands of the wrong person could create a dystopian future. Only it's not the future. When you get there, it's the timeline. It's the now. I want you to understand that it's immensely complicated, but to get it is really, really simple. You can get this idea of a timeline, a tiny tube of potentiality that's constrained by history. If you ran over a tree, there's only one tree, it can't be Twin Pines Mall anymore. And this tiny tube is only so big because it's limited by all of history. This country invaded that country. This country changed their primary language or changed their educational system. History defines the present, right? Yesterday you flew to Kamchatka and went to sleep. You're not going to wake up in Uzbekistan. You're going to wake up in Kamchatka. Yes? Right? Otherwise, this wouldn't be a timeline. It would be a bunch of spotty little points of history that you'd be teleporting between, and it would confuse the hell out of you. Because you can't imagine going to sleep in one place and waking up in another every day. Your history constrains your present. And so what happens is that you get a kind of line, a tube, that runs from the past to the present and then hopefully into the future. Right? And that tube must exist within the giant storm drain kind of space. Because just as you have to exist as a human within your timeline, humans have to exist within the range that supports humans. You get outside that, you're like a fish out of a fish tank, you die. Okay? Nothing too complicated. Now, let's imagine that you're one of these people who wants to go back in time and assassinate Hitler. Or for the more civilized among us, you're going to go back in time and find a young Hitler and compliment his art. So he stays an artist and doesn't become a dick or a dictator. Right? Most people have thought of this. Most of you have only thought of killing the guy because you're savages. But there are many ways you could have kept him from getting into power. And maybe that would have made the timeline far better, because maybe World War II would have happened. Maybe it would have made it far worse. You don't know. So you can imagine in terms of the little boy in Back to the Future going back and changing the past and the present being different. But all of your movies and stories tell you that it's immensely dangerous. Any tiny change can propagate out and cause your entire timeline to move around. And who knows if you'll make it better or worse. Maybe if Adolf hadn't been running Germany, the world would be worse right now. Maybe it'd be better. Who knows? Right? So you can imagine changing the past, and you can see how that would change where you are in the present. You can see it like in Back to the Future 2, where the doc draws a timeline on the board. It looks like he's diagramming a sentence when he draws that second timeline below. And Marty says, well, what's going to happen to my girlfriend? We can't leave her in that world. And Doc says, when we go back and fix the past, that whole timeline will fade away. It will never have happened. And so she won't be in that place. You don't have to worry about her. Yeah? I'm aware that some people think every decision that every molecule or atom or potentiality makes creates another timeline, and we've got, some trillion, quadrillion timelines running all over the place. It ain't true. If you're one of those stoics who says, science, damn it, it must be true, then stop listening to me, because I don't like people like that. It just doesn't work that way. There is a timeline in which humans exist. There are not billions or trillions or umptillions of other timelines with all these other possibilities. What there is a limited potentiality space, the sort of massive underground storm tunnel, water tunnel, that drains away water after a storm, right? There is this space, and then there is a timeline running through it. But throughout that, there's the potential for everything that you can imagine while still being human. There's the potential for it, but all those timelines aren't there. Just as the electron around the nucleus has a potential field for all of it, but when you observe it, you'll only find it in one place. You won't find a quadrillion electrons all running in parallel and say, look, parallel electrons. The same way there aren't trillions or more of parallel worlds. There's one timeline that humans have, and it can change. So that timeline wanders all over. And there are parts of that larger probability tube, right, the little lightsaber type light tube running through this large storm drain tube. There are points that are horrible. There are points where you get too close to the outside, everything's falling apart, and humans die off completely. There are points where it's wonderful, a sort of paradise, the stuff that you imagine in the best of your dreams. And there are lots of places in between. Right? And it's not just good to bad. It's not just light to shadow or beautiful to ugly. It's not just one dimension. I'm picturing it for you as a three-dimensional tube. The lightsaber running through the larger three-dimensional tube, the probability space in which humans can exist. But to understand it, you really need to see it as about a six-dimensional space, not a three. And I understand that people can't do that. And years ago I studied a little-known branch of mathematics where they talked about mapping out a hurricane, computer modeling a hurricane. And in effect, you have to model every tiny bit of air and its movement and its temperature and its speed and all these things. And it takes quadrillions of variables to map a hurricane, and no computer's good enough to do it. But this branch of mathematics hypothesized that even the most complex system in the world could be accurately modeled with 5 to 7 variables only, not trillions or more. It's just that those variables are so abstract that you would never understood what they mean. You would never understand it. You wouldn't get it. Right? You can take an immensely complex system like this storm drain, the probability of human experience, and map it in 5 to 7 dimensions, which is why I say about 6. It's just that those dimensions are so immensely abstract that you won't be able to understand them. So for now, you can take my word for it, or you can be one of those stoic ants marching down the center of the timeline and say, I don't buy this because the scientist never said it. Or you can be one of those people way outside who think they're a butterfly, see my words as little flowers and otherwise ignore them. Right? But the majority of people fall somewhere in there with some creativity, but not so much they're mad. For those of you, I tell you that there is a 6-dimensional probability space that is this storm drain. And the 6 dimensions, front to back, up and down, and so on. These dimensions are not simple things you can understand. They're very, very peculiar, abstract incomprehensible things. But that 6 dimensions is enough to define the entire potentiality. So if you want to find a world where the dragons are still flying over New York, you won't. Because there's only a single timeline running through here. But you can find a space in the potentiality field where dragons exist and they're still flying over New York. There's a potential for it. And when you know where that potential is, if you're skillful enough, you can shift the timeline to that place where dragons are flying over New York. Yeah? And it could be a hellish world where the dragons are destroying everything. You've got movies like that. It could be this beautiful thing where, like the Dragon Riders of Pern, McCaffrey's books, where the dragons are friends and, helpful. But the potentiality for most of what you can imagine within human experience exists in this 6-dimensional tube you're moving down. And you could create any of those things by going back in time and changing something to shift the timeline. The thing is, you come up with things like the grandfather paradox, which is an immensely stupid, bunky level understanding of time travel. Right? What if I screw up my own past, then I won't exist, and then I won't have gone back in time? It's a paradox. Oh no. This is idiocy. You got to have a brain of a monkey to come up with something like that. But the reason is because you can't imagine a 6-dimensional space, and you can't imagine these abstract variables that represent the dimensions. There's no such thing as a grandfather paradox. Right? There are no paradoxes in time travel. It's all very, very simple. It all makes wonderful sense. That's why you can have an idiot like Doctor Who doing it, and right? He never wiped himself out. And so if you made the right changes along your sort of lightsaber tube of light running down in this storm-drained potentiality 6-dimensional space, if you could make the right changes, you could slowly shift the timeline to go through a new space. And that is what's going on now. That's what's been going on for, a long time, but largely centered between 2010 and 2015, a lot of these changes. And the idea has been to bring your world from something where humans destroyed themselves, which happened in the first timeline. Wiped out the world, there were no more humans, boom, you're all dead. To slowly improving it to a kind of paradise, where everything is so much better than you can imagine right now, and all the savagery and primitive ugly in this world, these things are gone. Right? This sort of idealized world that maximizes human potential and completely removes fear and anger and aggression and so on. Right? And it's possible if you were clever enough to make just 1 or 2 or very few changes, and bam, you go from this timeline that destroys itself and ends to this perfect one. Right? If you were smart enough and understood the variables, you could find a small number of changes to quickly move from the first timeline to the last timeline, to the improved, the golden timeline. All right, one moment. As I struggle to keep breathing, shifting timelines is more difficult than you might think. Actually making the changes, right? Going back and finding La Gioconda and having amazing sex with her the day before she gets painted as the Mona Lisa, and so now she's smiling instead of looking grumpy. This is easy. Anybody could do that. Well, anybody who's a competent lover can do that. It's not difficult, right? You see examples in your movies. I remember these guys in black suits and little bowler caps, and they're told, when this guy comes out of his apartment, bump him and spill coffee on him. And then he'll go back and change his shirt, and he won't get on this bus, and he won't meet this girl that screws everything up in the future. These little changes are trivial. Right? So easy to do. Make sure 2 people never meet. Or in it, like Back to the Future, when the boy goes back and screws up the relationship between his mother and his father, so that they don't fall in love, and then he's got to repair it. Right? These changes are easy. Any bumbling buffoon can change things. It doesn't take any skill. Okay? The problem is that you're trying to direct the timeline into a specific place. And so just making random changes, it's almost certain to make things worse. No matter how well intentioned you are, you'll probably make things worse. Because you don't understand it, it's too complicated. So it takes someone who can do this six-dimensional math across this entire potentiality space of the storm drain and slowly shift the timeline up. Why slowly? See, this is kind of why I started. Because a lot of you were saying, my boyfriend's still an asshole, my neighbors are still mean, my parents still don't understand me. If this is a better future, why hasn't it happened yet? Why are we just seeing the Dash and Kit Kat disappear, or Sally Field instead of Sally Fields? Why are we seeing these small things? What you need to understand is almost everything you're seeing doesn't matter. Changes are being made to reshape the timeline, and these are just ripples coming off it. Right? They're the tiny little things you notice. I'm not talking about Australia moving or continental stuff. I don't care about that at the moment. Right? The many things, if you've ever watched a video and here's this Mandela Effect, it's crazy, Looney Tunes, Fruit Loops, right? These are just sort of ripples that are happening because the entire lightsaber-sized tube is changing, is shifting. And when things change, right, like a fish moving through water, when it changes directions, it creates little ripples, or a boat moving through water, it turns and you see its wake, spreading waves out. These are just, little ducks floating on the wake and wondering why the world's bobbing up and down. It is possible to do it more quickly. However, there are 3 constraints, and I'm going to see if I can remember them. One is the artists and the butterflies, the people who are too far away from the central timeline. There's a kind of gravity to that timeline that pulls them back in, and their insanity or creativity keeps them from collapsing into the center. Right? This sort of variance. If the timeline changed too quickly, a lot of those artists and wonderful people, the creatives, the visionaries, the prophets, would be left behind. Because they're right on that edge. If it changed too quickly, they would drift away from the timeline and be out of the space in which they could exist. Right? The next is the stoics, the angry little ants marching down the center saying, I know my world is real, I know the scientists said, I know my God exists. They narrow, aggressive little people who don't have even the tiniest bit of creativity. Because they're so rigidly marching, if the timeline changed too suddenly, they would keep marching and fall off it completely. You see both of these effects in some of the Mandela people. The second one you can see with, no, you're changing my history, what the hell's wrong with you? Some evil AI demon is changing the world, and all this anger and aggression and fight. I refuse to accept it, we have to fight this thing. Right? If they push far enough in this direction, they will fall out of potentiality and simply won't have existed at all. So we have the butterflies and the ants. And I've totally slipped it. I'm too weak to be doing this talking at the moment. But at least one other that matters is sanity. Right? If you woke up every day and the sky was a different color, you'd think, so what? The sky's a different color today. It's always a different color. Let's see what color the sky is today. Oh, not my favorite color. Or, oh, I love it, it's pink. Right? Day to day it would change. But if tomorrow you went out and the sky were blood red, people would be screaming, it's the end of the world. They'd be selling all their stocks and crashing the stock market. They'd be killing people and fighting and struggling. These movements of the timeline shake things up. And so if it changes too quickly, all of this shaking up within, it creates pressure. Just like molecules within an Erlenmeyer flask. They start moving faster and faster, what you get is greater pressure. Right? This is, eventually the flask will explode. This is what pressure is how rapidly the little electrons or little bits or molecules really, how fast the little molecules are bouncing around off the sides. And if they start bouncing too fast, it creates too much pressure, bam, it blows up. Right? And so this shift needs to be almost glacially slow so that the vast majority of people don't notice it. But not so slow that it takes 1,000,000 years to happen. And so the people who are a little more aware will be noticing, but the majority will be saying, oh, you're crazy, it's not happening. Right? In order to maintain stability. And it can't be too fast for the butterflies because they get lost, wander off into nothing, into potentiality and fade away. Or for the angry stoic people down the center. All of these things have to be considered in making these shifts. And each shift, it's not like someone can just poke the timeline and say, hey, move over, buddy, this is my spot. You have to go back to a specific point in time and make a tiny change to shift the timeline a tiny amount. And you've got to do this over the entire span of history, just jumping all over, making almost an infinite number of infinitesimally small changes. But all of them with this great sense of harmony and awareness of the 6 dimensions of completely abstract variables to gently shift the timeline so you disrupt as few as possible of the ants and the butterflies, create too much pressure and destroy things gently over time, over time, over time, over time. Yeah? And so when you look around and you say, nothing's changing, I don't like it, it's not fair. Or, too much is changing, damn it, I want my old world back. I don't like my lungs where they are. This spine looks ugly. I want my old spine back. Whichever side of that you're on, it's not happening fast enough, it's happening too fast. It is happening perfectly. This immensely delicate balance between the butterflies and ants will be lost, the people who are shaking up and so on, and maintaining the integrity of the timeline and moving it not just to a new space, but ultimately to the idealized space, the perfect timeline that we're headed to. And I've been promising you for years that you would be in that, well, not the perfect timeline, but into a world so vastly improved you wouldn't believe it's your world, between 2022 and 2025. And most of the shifting happened between October 2010 and October 2015 to begin to cause drift and move the world up to this more idealized timeline. Yeah. So it is happening as fast as it can happen without causing a lot more chaos. And so times it seems way, way too slow. And day after day when we're hurting, when we're struggling, when we wish it would go faster and say, why is nobody listening to me? Why doesn't it get better? It is. Right? But sometimes in order to shift the entire timeline from point A to point B, it actually has to drop to a worse timeline, point C, before it can get up to point B. If you can't imagine that, go look up 3-stage learning. The graph is the same. To move to a slightly better timeline, you got to go through a slightly worse one. And so all of this is happening right now. And whoever you are, your knowledge, like the little child in a tent in their backyard pretending they're Lewis and Clark or Robin of the Hood or whatever explorer you know of, you only have so much perspective. You might look at the world and say it's getting worse, right? A religious person might look at the world and say the number of people who believe in religion is falling all the time. Religion is disappearing. That's terrible. Oh my God, what will we do? But you could be one of those who sees the destructive side of religion, and you say, oh look, all of that destructiveness is fading away, and in the future we can have a spirituality and maybe beliefs and all this wonderful stuff without being freighted down by, a God story that is a snuff film and ritual cannibalism or virgins in heaven to deflower. And you could see it as far better. Right? So some will see the same change as good, while others will see it as bad. You need to relax. You don't have any control. It doesn't matter how many good thoughts you think or how much of a dick you are, you're not changing the shifting of the timeline. You're not. It's being guided by much, much bigger hands. And it will end up where it needs to end up no matter what you do. If there were 100,000 of you doing it, it wouldn't matter. Right? Or if you died altogether, it wouldn't matter. That timeline is shifting. It's only constrained by those three things. Protecting the butterflies, protecting the ants, keeping the pressure within reason. There's nothing you can do but watch it happen. This is what's going on now. The one thing you can do, a couple of things, but we'll keep it simple, is that you can change where you end up within that lightsaber tube. Are you in a place of health and wealth and a life full of the things you love, or are you miserable and unhappy? You can change that. And you do it by focusing on all of the wonderful things that are happening and creating in your life joy and beauty and passion. And as you do this, you cause your awareness to expand and you chart a better and better path for yourself within that little tube of potential that is your timeline. Or you can fight it and say, God damn it, evil governments, Nibiru, AIs, AI demons, CERN, D-wave computing. You can look at all these things and create hate and decrease your awareness more and more and more by creating all this darkness around you until you can't see anything. And without the larger awareness, then you don't get to choose where you're going within this lightsaber tube, this timeline. You don't get to choose. You end up being wherever you've put yourself with all your hate. Right? So really, this is what you can do. You can't change the big picture. They are too powerful. They're too powerful, the entities, the ones who are guiding this process. It will end up where it's going to end up, and there isn't a damn thing you can do. You're like a salmon swimming upstream trying to change the course of the river so it's easier to swim. Yeah, you keep imagining the river changing, what you're going to do is end up jumping out of the river and flopping around on the shore and being eaten by something. You can't change the river. You can only swim in it. Yeah. But if you do that with awareness and joy, you create the maximum potential in the world that is being created. If you do it with fear, anger, hate, criticism, abuse, ugliness, you minimize your potential and guarantee that either you'll have a terrible future or you'll be one of those ants or butterflies that's left behind as the timeline shifts.